Hello friends, welcome aboard the Starlight Fairy Tale Train. This train is a dream journey to fairy tale land. Have you all got your train tickets? Subscribe and hit the like button to always be able to ride. Close your eyes, prick up your ears, and listen in a comfortable position. Grimm's Fairy Tales. Today's story is Hansel and Gretel. In front of a large forest, a poor woodcutter lived with his new wife and 2 children. The boy was named Hansel, and the girl was Gretel. The woodcutter's home lacked sufficient food, and during a famine, they could not even find enough bread for everyone to share. One night, the woodcutter lay in bed, tossing and turning with worry, and sighed to his wife. "How shall we survive? We don't have enough to eat. How can we sufficiently feed the children?" His wife whispered back, "Dear, what if we take the children to the deepest part of the forest early at dawn, light a fire, give them each a piece of bread, and then leave them there while we go to work? They won't find their way home." "What? No, dear. I will never do such a thing. To abandon our children in the forest. How could I bear the guilt when wild beasts would soon tear them apart? How foolish you sound. If we don't do this, all 4 of us will starve to death. If we all die, the only thing left for you will be to make coffins out of wood." The wife nagged until her husband agreed. "But how can I bear to see our children suffer?" Overhearing their stepmother convincing their father, Hansel and Gretel, who were their father, noticing something odd, asked, "Hansel, what are you looking at? If you keep doing that, you'll be left behind. Be careful, and don't forget to walk." "I'm looking at a white cat on the roof saying goodbye to me," Hansel lied. His stepmother intervened. "Silly boy. That's not a cat, that's the morning sun shining on the chimney." Hansel was not looking at a cat but was dropping the white pebbles from his pocket onto the path. When they reached the middle of the forest, their father said, "All right, children, gather some branches. I'll start a fire so you won't be cold." Hansel and Gretel collected enough branches to make a small mountain, and, once the fire was burning well, their stepmother said, "Children, lie down by the fire and rest. We'll go further into the forest to chop wood, and when we're done, we'll come back for you." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and at noon, they ate their given pieces of bread. They still heard chopping noises and believed their father was nearby. However, it wasn't the sound of an axe. Their father had tied a branch to a withered tree, and when the wind blew, the branch would hit the tree, creating the noise. After sitting too long, fatigue overtook them, and the children fell into a deep sleep. When they awoke, it was pitch black night. Gretel began to cry. "How will we get out of the forest?" Hansel consoled her. "Just wait until the moon rises. Then we'll find the way." Once the moon was brightly shining, Hansel took his sister's hand and followed the pebbles, which now sparkled under the moonlight like freshly minted silver coins, guiding them home. They walked through the night, and by dawn, they reached their house. We need to take them deeper into the forest. Otherwise, it's the end for all of us. Burdened by past events, the father decided that this time he would share even the last crumb of bread with his children. However, the stepmother did not listen to him and kept nagging and berating him relentlessly. Once you start something, you must continue, it's the rule. Since the father had already given in before, he had no choice but to agree again. The children were awake the entire time and heard everything. When their parents were asleep, Hansel intended to go out and collect pebbles as before, but the stepmother had locked the door tightly. Nevertheless, Hansel comforted his sister. "Don't cry, Gretel. Go to sleep without worry. God will help us." Early in the morning, the stepmother came and dragged the children from bed. They each received a piece of bread, though smaller than before. As they walked to the forest, Hansel broke his piece of bread into small crumbs and quietly, while pausing occasionally, dropped them on the ground. "Hansel, why do you keep stopping and dawdling? Move along briskly." "I was watching my dove on the roof saying goodbye," Hansel lied again. The stepmother intervened. "Silly boy. That's not your dove, that's the morning sun shining on the chimney." Hansel, regardless, dropped every piece of bread he had on the path. The stepmother took them to a part of the forest they had never been before and started a large campfire. "Children, they walked all night and all day, but could not get out of the forest. They had only eaten a few fruits from the trees, so their stomachs were rumbling endlessly. Overwhelmed by fatigue and unable to walk any further, the children lay down under a tree and fell asleep. By the third morning since leaving their father's house, they tried to find their way again, but only went deeper into the forest. If they did not get help, they would die from hunger and thirst. Around noon, they saw a beautiful and white bird sitting on a branch, singing so beautifully that they stopped to listen. After finishing its song, the bird flapped its wings and began to fly ahead of the children. They followed the bird until it stopped and perched on the roof of a house. As they approached, the children realized the house was made of bread. The roof was covered with cake, and the windows were made of bright sugar. Hansel exclaimed, "Wow, let's eat this house. It looks delicious. Gretel, I'll eat a piece of the roof, and you eat the window. It will be sweet." Hansel climbed up to the roof, and Gretel stood in front of a window, both nibbling. It was a feast day for the witch. Although the witch had poor eyesight, her sense of smell was as sharp as an animal's, so she could detect people approaching. When Hansel and Gretel neared the house, the witch sneered menacingly. "Those children are mine. They won't escape again." Before the children woke up, The witch had already risen early in the morning and, looking at the plump, rosy-cheeked children sleeping so peacefully, she muttered, "They look so delicious." Then, she grabbed the scrawny Hansel and took him to a small cage, locking him behind bars. Hansel screamed for help, but it was useless. The witch then approached Gretel, shook her awake, and said, "Get up, you lazy girl. Fetch some water and cook some delicious food for your brother. He needs to fatten up in that cage outside. He has..." The witch crawled closer and stuck her head inside the oven. At that moment, Gretel kicked the witch hard from behind, pushing her into the oven, then slammed the iron door shut and locked it. The witch screamed terribly inside the oven, but Gretel walked away, ignoring her cries, and the witch was horrifically burned to death. Gretel immediately ran to her brother to open the cage door. "Brother, we survived. The old witch is dead." The door flew open, and Hansel sprang out like a bird freed from a cage. They were so happy that they hugged each other, jumped up and down, and kissed each other on the cheeks. Now that they had nothing to fear, they went into the witch's house. There were chests filled with pearls and jewels in every corner. "Better than pebbles," Hansel exclaimed and filled his pockets with the jewels. Gretel also stuffed her apron with jewels, saying, the completed red velvet cloak was indeed beautiful. That afternoon, the grandmother invited her granddaughter to her house. The grandmother cleaned the house and waited eagerly for her granddaughter, excited about how happy she would be. When the granddaughter finally arrived, the grandmother greeted her with a bright smile. "My dear granddaughter, I have prepared a special gift for you," the grandmother said warmly as she hugged her granddaughter and handed her the velvet cloak. The granddaughter's eyes sparkled with curiosity and anticipation. "Really, Grandma? What is it?" the granddaughter asked, her heart pounding with excitement. The grandmother gently smiled and handed the red velvet cloak to her granddaughter. "This cloak is something I made for you with all my heart. The granddaughter took the cloak from her grandmother, her eyes wide with wonder. She admired the soft velvet texture and beautiful red color of the cloak, and with a voice full of joy, she said, "Grandma, this is really beautiful. Can I try it on?" With a heart full of excitement, she put on the cloak. The red velvet cloak suited her perfectly. The cloak blended with her golden hair, making her look like a scene from a painting. She twirled in front of the mirror, watching the cloak flutter softly with her movements, looking as lovely as a princess from a fairy tale. The grandmother smiled warmly, watching her granddaughter's happiness. From that day on, the girl refused to wear any other cloak. No matter where she went or what she did, she always wore the red velvet cloak. She wore it to the village market, when playing with friends, and even during walks in the forest. Whenever she appeared wearing the cloak, the villagers always looked at her with amazement and smiled. "You look so beautiful, Red Riding Hood," they would say. "That red cloak suits you perfectly." The villagers' praises made her feel both shy and happy. So, naturally, they started calling her Little Red Riding Hood. Her real name was almost forgotten, and everyone called her Red Riding Hood. Red Riding Hood loved her new name. It felt like her name and the red velvet cloak had become one, making her feel even more special. Wearing the cloak made her feel like the most special girl in the village. Red Riding Hood was very proud of her cloak. The cloak her grandmother had made with great care held a special meaning for her. Every time she wore the cloak, she felt her grandmother's warm love. Wearing the cloak felt like her grandmother was hugging her tightly. It made Red Riding Hood feel braver and stronger. With her grandmother's love always with her, Red Riding Hood felt she had nothing to fear. That love made her even happier, and she was grateful to her grandmother every day. When she looked in the mirror wearing the cloak, she thought of her grandmother's smiling face. The cloak, filled with her grandmother's love, was her most precious treasure. Wearing it, she always felt happy, and the world seemed brighter and warmer. One morning, Red Riding Hood woke up in the bright sunlight. The warm rays of the sun embraced her face, signaling the start of a pleasant day. Outside the window, little birds were chirping joyfully, their sounds like beautiful music from nature. Red Riding Hood rubbed her eyes and looked out the window. She could hear her mother busily preparing something in the kitchen along with the birds chirping. Red Riding Hood headed to the kitchen. As soon as she opened the kitchen door, the delicious smell of cake tickled her nose. "Oh, what a delicious smell!" she murmured to herself as she walked into the kitchen. Her mother was busy baking cakes in front of the oven, a loving smile on her face. "What are you doing so early in the morning, Mother?" Red Riding Hood asked. Her mother smiled brightly and answered, "Red Riding Hood, you woke up early too. I am baking a cake for your grandmother. She has been very sick lately, so I want to bring her this cake and some wine." Red Riding Hood saw a beautifully decorated bottle of wine on the table next to a freshly baked warm cake. Her mother spoke gently to Red Riding Hood. "Red Riding Hood, I need you to visit your grandmother." Red Riding Hood listened carefully to her mother, whose voice was filled with kindness and concern. "Your grandmother is very sick and weak. Please bring her this piece of cake and this wine. She needs to eat and drink to regain her strength." Red Riding Hood nodded, understanding her mother's words. "Yes, Mother. I will go to Grandma," Red Riding Hood replied. She felt sad hearing that her grandmother was sick because she loved her grandmother very much. Red Riding Hood carefully placed the cake and the wine her mother had prepared into a small basket. The cake was freshly baked and warm, and the wine was in a pretty bottle. Red Riding Hood felt her heart ache at the news of her grandmother's illness. Her grandmother had always taken care of her with warmth, and the memories of her grandmother's loving care were precious to Red Riding Hood. "Yes, Mother. I will hurry to Grandma," Red Riding Hood replied with tears in her eyes. She carefully placed the cake and wine her mother had prepared into a small basket. The cake was freshly baked with a golden brown crust, lightly dusted with powdered sugar, emitting a sweet and savory aroma that filled the kitchen. The wine bottle sparkled with a bright red hue and was beautifully labeled. Red Riding Hood, holding the basket, vowed to herself to hurry to her grandmother. She longed to see her grandmother, remembering her warm touch and hoping that the cake and wine would help her recover. Before Red Riding Hood left, her mother gave her a concerned reminder. "When you walk, be calm and careful, and stay on the path. You might trip and break the wine bottle. Then there would be nothing for Grandma to drink." Her mother's voice was filled with deep worry and love. Red Riding Hood looked into her mother's eyes and replied, "Yes, Mother. I will be careful." She took her mother's words to heart. Her mother gently held Red Riding Hood's shoulders and made eye contact. "You must be really careful. If you leave the path, it could be dangerous, so always stay on the path." Her mother's touch was warm, and her eyes were filled with concern and love. Red Riding Hood understood her mother's feelings deeply and promised to safely visit her grandmother. Before Red Riding Hood set off, her mother gave her one last important reminder. "When you arrive at Grandma's house, don't forget to greet her first thing in the morning." Her voice was filled with genuine concern and love. "Be careful if you meet any strangers along the way," her mother said as she hugged Red Riding Hood tightly. "And make sure to behave properly with Grandma." Her mother gently held Red Riding Hood's shoulders and made eye contact. Her eyes were filled with her concern for her and deep love for her grandmother. Red Riding Hood looked into her mother's eyes and deeply felt her mother's worry and love. Her mother's words were deeply etched in her heart. The mother smiled, feeling her daughter's small hand on hers. Red Riding Hood's hand was soft and warm, comforting her mother's heart. She held Red Riding Hood's hand tightly and said, "Yes, Red Riding Hood. I trust that you will make Grandma happy. Be careful on your way." Her voice was filled with deep love and trust. Her mother gently caressed Red Riding Hood's face and looked at her with affection. "Go visit Grandma well and come back safely," she said with a warm smile. Red Riding Hood took her mother's warm touch and kind words to heart and firmly grasped the basket. She looked into her mother's eyes and nodded. "Yes, Mother. I will make Grandma happy and return safely," Red Riding Hood vowed. Red Riding Hood walked along the path carefully, keeping her mother's advice in mind. She cherished her mother's warm gaze in her heart as she walked to meet her grandmother. Thinking of her grandmother's bright smile, Red Riding Hood quickened her steps. The air in the forest was fresh and clear, and her heart was filled with her mother's love. The grandmother lived in a small cottage in the forest, about half an hour away from the village. It was a quiet and peaceful place, with trees surrounding the cottage, creating a cozy atmosphere. The cottage was a quaint wooden house with a roof covered in green moss, blending seamlessly with nature. The windows had flower-patterned curtains, and pretty flower pots that the grandmother had made herself were placed in front of the door. Around the cottage was a garden that the grandmother tended to with care. The garden bloomed with various flowers in different seasons. In the spring, colorful tulips and fragrant daffodils bloomed brightly. In the summer, the garden was filled with red roses and purple lavender. In the fall, chrysanthemums and sunflowers bloomed, turning the garden yellow. In the winter, holly with red berries and evergreen trees decorated the garden. The grandmother spent a lot of time in this garden and loved living in harmony with nature. In one corner of the garden was a small pond where little fish and frogs lived. Next to the pond was a pretty wooden bench and a small table where the grandmother enjoyed drinking tea and reading books. She loved spending time with her granddaughter there whenever she visited. The day Red Riding Hood visited was always special to the grandmother. She treasured the time she spent with her granddaughter, preparing delicious food and sharing interesting stories. Red Riding Hood also cherished the time spent with her grandmother more than anyone else. Red Riding Hood walked along the path to her grandmother's house, looking around. The forest path was thickly covered with trees, and pretty wildflowers bloomed along the way. Yellow dandelions, blue violets, and small white daisies greeted her steps. The air in the forest was fresh and refreshing. A gentle breeze softly caressed Red Riding Hood's face. Birds chirped among the trees, welcoming her, and their songs added to the peaceful atmosphere of the forest. Red Riding Hood hurried her steps, taking a deep breath of the fresh forest air, eager to meet her grandmother. The shade provided by the trees made the path cool and pleasant. As she walked, she enjoyed the occasional sunlight filtering through the leaves. The sunlight sparkled through the branches, making her red cloak shine even brighter. Red Riding Hood quickened her pace, thinking of her grandmother waiting for her. She occasionally paused to look at the flowers blooming along the path. The flowers were as beautiful as those in her grandmother's garden. She was excited to talk about these flowers with her grandmother. She eagerly wanted to reach her grandmother, give her the cake and wine, and see her grandmother's bright smile. As Red Riding Hood reached the depths of the forest, she encountered a large wolf. The wolf stared at her with dark, gleaming eyes. His eyes looked sharp and cunning, but Red Riding Hood didn't notice. She thought the wolf was just another animal in the forest because she didn't know how wicked he was. Red Riding Hood was not scared at all. She even tried to greet the wolf warmly. "Hello. I'm Red Riding Hood. I'm on my way to my grandmother's house." She never thought the wolf could be dangerous. Holding the basket tightly, she approached the wolf and greeted him more brightly. Her heart was pure and warm, so she had no idea the wolf had evil intentions. The wolf approached Red Riding Hood slowly, watching her closely. His eyes gleamed with cunning, but Red Riding Hood didn't notice. The wolf's fur was a mix of black and gray, and his sharp teeth slightly showed from a sly smile. The wolf greeted her with a gentle voice. "Hello, Red Riding Hood." His voice was kind and friendly, but hidden within was his cunning intent. Red Riding Hood felt reassured by the wolf's kind demeanor and replied, "Yes, I'm Red Riding Hood. I'm on my way to my grandmother's house." She held the basket tightly and smiled brightly at the wolf. Feeling reassured by the wolf's kind demeanor, Red Riding Hood began to ask more questions. "Do you live in this forest? It's such a beautiful place. Even though it's a long way to Grandma's house, I love passing through here." She asked the wolf about the forest, opening up more because of his kindness. The wolf smiled inwardly and replied, "Yes, I live in this forest. I stay here with many other animals. If the path to your grandmother's house is long, I can help. I know the way well and can guide you there." His voice remained soft and kind, but his cunning plan was still hidden beneath his words. Red Riding Hood was delighted by the wolf's offer and nodded. "Thank you so much, Wolf. I needed your help." She held the basket tightly and started walking with the wolf. Feeling reassured by the wolf's kind demeanor, she followed his guidance. The wolf approached Red Riding Hood with a sly smile, becoming more friendly. His eyes still gleamed with cunning, but Red Riding Hood didn't notice. "Red Riding Hood, isn't this forest beautiful? The trees are lush, and the flowers are blooming so beautifully," the wolf said in a soft and kind voice. Red Riding Hood nodded and replied, "Yes, the forest is really beautiful. My grandmother is very sick, so I'm bringing her cake and wine." She told the wolf about her grandmother's illness, expressing her desire to get to her quickly. The wolf nodded and said, "Oh, I see. It's so sad that your grandmother is very sick. Follow me. I will guide you safely to her house." The wolf approached Red Riding Hood pretending to be kind. His voice remained soft and kind, but his cunning plan was still hidden beneath his words. Red Riding Hood was delighted by the wolf's offer and thanked him. "Thank you so much, wolf. I needed your help." She held the basket tightly and started walking with the wolf. Feeling reassured by the wolf's kind demeanor, she followed his guidance. Red Riding Hood replied innocently to the wolf's question without any suspicion. "I'm going to my grandmother's house. She is very sick, so I'm bringing her cake and wine," she said with a voice filled with deep concern and love for her grandmother. Red Riding Hood worried about her grandmother's health and wanted to get there as soon as possible. The wolf listened to Red Riding Hood's answer and nodded, smiling slyly to himself. "Oh, I see. It's so sad that your grandmother is very sick. You are such a kind granddaughter, traveling such a long way for her." His voice remained soft and kind, but his cunning plan was still hidden beneath his words. The wolf approached Red Riding Hood with a kind demeanor to gain her trust. Red Riding Hood was delighted by the wolf's kind offer and thanked him. "Thank you so much, wolf. I needed your help." She held the basket tightly and started walking with the wolf. Feeling reassured by the wolf's kind demeanor, she followed his guidance, thinking about meeting her grandmother and feeling even more excited. The forest air was clear and fresh, and the sunlight filtering through the trees made her red cloak shine even brighter. Birds chirped among the branches, welcoming the two of them, and pretty wildflowers bloomed along the path. Red Riding Hood enjoyed the scenery around her, but the wolf was secretly planning his next move. The wolf glanced under Red Riding Hood's apron and asked, "What's under your apron?" His voice remained soft and kind, but his mind was filled with a cunning plan. The wolf's eyes were fixed on Red Riding Hood's basket, gleaming with curiosity and desire. He expected Red Riding Hood to give him important information. Without any suspicion, Red Riding Hood held up the basket under her cloak and replied, "This basket has a gift for my grandmother." Her expression was bright and pure, filled with trust that the wolf was there to help her. The wolf listened to Red Riding Hood's answer and nodded, smiling slyly to himself. "I see. Your grandmother must be very happy." He continued to act kind, trying to gain Red Riding Hood's trust. His mind was filled with a plan to harm both Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, but he maintained a kind and gentle demeanor. Red Riding Hood felt reassured by the wolf's kindness and continued to follow his guidance. She was eager to meet her grandmother and give her the gift. The wolf continued to act kind and friendly, using Red Riding Hood's innocence to further his plan. Red Riding Hood held up the basket proudly and said, "There is cake and wine that my mother baked yesterday. I'm bringing it for my sick grandmother, hoping she will regain her strength by eating something delicious." She showed the gifts in her basket to the wolf, thinking about her grandmother. The cake emitted a sweet and savory aroma, and the wine sparkled in its clear bottle. The cake was baked to a golden brown and topped with a layer of soft cream. Red Riding Hood smiled, imagining how happy her grandmother would be to receive the cake. She felt sad thinking about her grandmother's illness. She wanted her grandmother to regain her strength by eating her favorite cake and drinking the wine her mother had prepared with love. Holding the basket tightly, Red Riding Hood showed the gifts to the wolf, expressing her love for her grandmother. The wolf listened to Red Riding Hood's answer and thought of a cunning plan. Seeing that Red Riding Hood answered his questions without any suspicion, he tried to gather more information. The wolf intended to get as much information from her as possible, using her trust to his advantage. He continued to maintain a kind smile, planning his next move. Knowing that Red Riding Hood was on her way to her grandmother with a cake and wine, the wolf came up with a plan to reach her grandmother's house first, eat the grandmother, and then eat Red Riding Hood. He was confident that his plan would go smoothly as Red Riding Hood showed no signs of suspicion. With a sly smile, the wolf gently asked Red Riding Hood, "Red Riding Hood, where does your grandmother live?" His voice remained soft and kind, but his mind was filled with a cunning plan. He expected Red Riding Hood to answer his question without any suspicion, eagerly awaiting her response. Red Riding Hood paused for a moment to think. She considered how to explain her grandmother's house and decided to answer the wolf kindly. Believing that the wolf was asking to help, she began to describe the location of her grandmother's house in detail. After thinking for a moment, Red Riding Hood kindly replied to the wolf, "My grandmother's house is about 15 minutes further into the forest, under 3 big oak trees. It's easy to find because there is a walnut fence around it. I'm sure you know the place." She described the location of her grandmother's house, her eyes shining with anticipation to see her grandmother. As Red Riding Hood described her grandmother's house, she thought about how special the place was. The house was deep in the forest, but the oak trees and walnut fence made it easy to find. She felt excited, imagining her grandmother waiting for her at home. The wolf listened to Red Riding Hood's answer and nodded. His eyes gleamed as he began to formulate a cunning plan. The location of her grandmother's house was now clear in his mind. The house was under 3 big oak trees and surrounded by a walnut fence. Knowing that Red Riding Hood did not suspect him, the wolf's plan became even more detailed. Smiling slyly to himself, the wolf said to Red Riding Hood, "I see, that's really good information. Your grandmother must be very happy." He continued to act kind, trying to gain her trust. His mind was set on his plan to eat both the grandmother and Red Riding Hood. Red Riding Hood hurried down the path, eager to meet her grandmother. The thought of her grandmother waiting for her quickened her steps. She felt happy thinking about the delicious food her grandmother would have prepared and the warm smile that would greet her. The forest path remained beautiful, and the birds' songs brightened her mood even more. She walked faster, eager to reach her grandmother and give her the cake and wine. The forest air was fresh and clear, and the sunlight filtering through the trees warmly embraced her. Red Riding Hood enjoyed the beauty of the forest as she continued her journey to meet her grandmother. Her heart beat faster with excitement at the thought of seeing her grandmother. The wolf watched Red Riding Hood walk away, a sinister thought forming in his mind. A tender little girl, what a perfect prey she'll be. She'll surely taste better than the old woman. To eat them both, I must start perfectly. Smiling to himself, the wolf began crafting his plan to devour both Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. Confident in his plan, the wolf knew exactly where to find the grandmother's house thanks to Red Riding Hood's detailed directions. He decided to head there first, deal with the grandmother, and then wait for Red Riding Hood. He was sure she had no suspicions and was confident he could completely deceive her. The wolf resolved to first eat the grandmother and then Red Riding Hood. He let Red Riding Hood continue along the forest path while he took a shortcut to the grandmother's cottage. Smirking with satisfaction at how easily he had tricked her, his eyes glinted with cunning as he thought about his sinister plan to eliminate both the grandmother and Red Riding Hood. The wolf quickly moved through the forest, pushing through trees and bushes as he took the shortcut to the grandmother's house. With each step, he refined his plan to ambush the grandmother. As he got closer to the cottage, his steps became more deliberate, and his devious scheme grew more precise in his mind. Meanwhile, Red Riding Hood hurried along the path, eager to meet her grandmother. She felt happy that the wolf had spoken kindly to her, thinking of him as a good friend. She enjoyed the company and the chance to chat while walking to her grandmother's house. Feeling reassured by the wolf's friendly demeanor, Red Riding Hood walked along the forest path with renewed enthusiasm. The thought of seeing her grandmother filled her with excitement, making her walk faster. The forest remained beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the trees and birds singing, making her feel at ease. After walking quietly beside Red Riding Hood for a while, the wolf spoke again. "Red Riding Hood, look at these beautiful flowers blooming here. Why don't you take a moment to enjoy them? You're walking as if you're in a hurry to school, missing all the fun things in this forest." His voice was gentle and kind, though his mind was filled with evil plans. Red Riding Hood listened to the wolf and looked around. She finally noticed the beauty of the forest again. The wolf's plan was to distract her long enough so he could reach the grandmother's house first. His gentle encouragement led Red Riding Hood to pause and enjoy the surroundings. Red Riding Hood stopped to look at the flowers around her. She saw red roses, yellow marigolds, and blue violets all mingling to create a beautiful pattern in the forest. Dewdrops sparkled on the petals, forming tiny rainbows in the sunlight. She admired the flowers, gently touching the petals. Their fragrance was fresh and sweet, making her feel happy. Red Riding Hood thought about making a beautiful bouquet for her grandmother. "These flowers are so beautiful, Wolf. Thank you for pointing them out. I would have missed them otherwise," she said, enjoying the moment. Red Riding Hood slowly walked, following the wolf's suggestion to enjoy the forest's beauty. She wandered among the flowers, looking closely at each one. The red roses were in full bloom, the yellow marigolds shone like little suns, and the blue violets exuded a delicate fragrance that captivated her. She touched the soft petals, breathing in the sweet scent. Grandmother would love these flowers, she thought, planning to gather a bouquet for her. Enjoying the peaceful scenery, she felt calm and happy. The sunlight streaming through the trees warmed her, and the birds' song sounded like a harmonious choir. Red Riding Hood cherished this moment, immersing herself in the forest's beauty. Up in the trees, the birds were chirping. Their songs echoed beautifully through the forest, creating a chorus of nature. Red Riding Hood listened carefully to the melodic exchanges between the birds, realizing that she had been missing this stunning scenery in her haste. Red Riding Hood stopped for a moment to focus on the birds' songs. The melodies were clear and serene, breaking the forest's silence while creating a peaceful atmosphere. She closed her eyes and let the sounds calm her mind. The birds' songs seemed to tell the story of nature's beauty. Red Riding Hood listened intently, fully absorbing the tranquility of the forest. She realized that in her hurry, she had overlooked these beautiful moments. The birds' songs warmed her heart, filling her with a sense of calm and joy. The path was lined with vibrant flowers. Red, yellow, pink, and purple blooms created a colorful tapestry. Dewdrops sparkled on the petals, and the flowers swayed gently in the breeze, as if dancing. Red Riding Hood was mesmerized by their beauty. She wandered among the flowers, captivated by their colors and scents. Each petal she touched was soft, and the dewdrops glittered on her fingertips. The fresh fragrance uplifted her spirits, making her feel even happier. She admired each flower closely, appreciating their unique beauty. Red Riding Hood thought of her grandmother as she looked around. How delighted grandmother will be with a bouquet of these freshly picked flowers, she mused, feeling warmth in her heart. Imagining her grandmother's joy brought a smile to her face, strengthening her resolve. Determined to collect more flowers for her grandmother, Red Riding Hood carefully picked the most beautiful ones she could find. The flowers' vibrant colors and sweet scents filled her with joy as she envisioned presenting the bouquet to her grandmother. Her basket gradually filled with flowers, and she felt a growing sense of happiness and anticipation. It's still early. Even if I leave the path, I'll reach in time, Red Riding Hood assured herself, venturing deeper into the forest to gather the most beautiful flowers for her grandmother. She decided to explore the forest instead of sticking to the path, seeking out the prettiest blooms. As she ventured deeper, she discovered rare flowers not seen along the path. The secluded part of the forest was quiet and serene, with flowers glowing in the sunlight. Red Riding Hood picked each flower carefully, filling her basket. She felt thrilled by the beauty she found and imagined her grandmother's delight upon receiving the bouquet. Her basket filled with flowers, Red Riding Hood's excitement grew as she thought about surprising her grandmother with the lovely gift. Red Riding Hood began to carefully pick the flowers one by one. She gently touched the petals with her fingertips, selecting the freshest flowers adorned with dewdrops. Each flower boasted its unique fragrance and color, making the forest even more vibrant. Red Riding Hood felt joy in the softness of the petals and the refreshing scents. Red roses, yellow marigolds, blue violets, and various other flowers filled her basket, making the bouquet more and more abundant. The dewdrops on the flowers glistened in the sunlight, their beauty warming Red Riding Hood's heart. As she carefully picked the flowers, she felt satisfied seeing the bouquet for her grandmother come together. Imagining how happy her grandmother would be upon receiving the bouquet, Red Riding Hood continued to gather the flowers with even more enthusiasm. The fresh forest flowers filled her basket, and their beauty brought her great happiness. Meanwhile, the wolf took advantage of the time Red Riding Hood spent gathering flowers and headed straight for the grandmother's house. He remembered the location that Red Riding Hood had described and moved quickly. Following the forest path, the wolf finally arrived at the grandmother's cottage. The wolf surveyed the area and confirmed the location of the cottage. It was deep in the forest, and the surroundings were quiet. Satisfied with finding the grandmother's house, the wolf approached it. His eyes gleamed with cunning, and he began to formulate his devious plan. Standing at the front door, the wolf took a moment to catch his breath and mentally prepare to deceive the grandmother. Mimicking Red Riding Hood's voice, he prepared to trick the grandmother. Then, he carefully knocked on the door. The wolf stood at the door, catching his breath and adjusting his voice to sound like the grandmother's. He then reached out and knocked on the door. Knock, knock, knock. The wolf waited anxiously for the grandmother to open the door. Inside the cottage, there was no sound. Growing more impatient, the wolf knocked again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. His anxiety increased as he waited. From inside the door, a weak voice of the grandmother was heard. "Who is it?" The grandmother's voice sounded tired and weak. Curious about who was knocking, she struggled to get up from the bed. Weakened by her long illness, she moved slowly and looked towards the door. The wolf, imitating Red Riding Hood's voice, replied, "It's Red Riding Hood. I brought cake and wine for you. Please open the door." The wolf spoke as gently and kindly as possible. His voice even trembled slightly to reassure the grandmother. Hearing her granddaughter's voice, the grandmother felt relieved and decided to open the door. She joyfully responded, "Come in, Red Riding Hood. Open the door and come inside." The grandmother, believing it was her granddaughter, happily responded, "Press the latch. I'm too weak to get up." Her voice was weak and feeble. She lay in bed, eagerly waiting to welcome her granddaughter. The grandmother lay in bed, anticipating her granddaughter's arrival. She looked forward to the cake and wine Red Riding Hood had brought, and her heart was filled with joy at the thought of seeing her granddaughter after a long time. The grandmother smiled, imagining her granddaughter's bright face. The wolf carefully pressed the latch. As the door creaked open, he entered the house without saying a word. The inside of the cottage was warm and cozy, with the walls adorned with the grandmother's handmade knitting and old family photos. A small fire burned in the fireplace, making the room even warmer. The wolf looked around the room with a sly smile. The grandmother's knitted work showed her touch and dedication, and the old family photos held her precious memories. The wolf slowly approached the bed where the grandmother lay. His steps were quiet and deliberate. The wolf cautiously took one step at a time towards the bed. The grandmother lay there, still smiling, thinking her granddaughter had arrived. Her face was full of joy, and she waited eagerly to see her granddaughter. But without saying a word, the wolf approached the bed and pounced on the grandmother. She tried to scream in surprise, but it was too late. The wolf quickly devoured the grandmother. She struggled in shock and fear, but she was helpless against the wolf's strength. After swallowing the grandmother, the wolf patted his belly with a satisfied expression. Having devoured the grandmother, the wolf patted his belly with a satisfied expression. He quickly dressed in the grandmother's clothes, put on her hat, and lay down in the bed, pulling the curtains shut. The wolf waited for Red Riding Hood to arrive, curling up as small as possible to look like the grandmother. He practiced mimicking the grandmother's voice several times. The wolf's voice gradually became more like the grandmother's. Satisfied with his efforts, he smiled to himself. The room grew dark, and the wolf, hidden behind the curtains, prepared to deceive Red Riding Hood by pretending to be the grandmother. The wolf lay in bed, repeatedly practicing the grandmother's voice. His voice gradually sounded more like the grandmother's, and he believed he had perfected his disguise. The room grew dark, and the wolf carefully hid behind the curtains, moving cautiously to act like the grandmother. His eyes gleamed with cunning as he waited silently for Red Riding Hood to arrive. Red Riding Hood was wandering through the forest, picking beautiful flowers here and there. She carefully placed flowers of various colors and shapes into her basket. Red, yellow, pink, and purple flowers combined to create a vibrant bouquet. As Red Riding Hood picked each flower, she thought about her grandmother. The thought of how happy her grandmother would be upon seeing these flowers warmed her heart. Imagining her grandmother's smiling face, she diligently continued to gather flowers. The forest flowers sparkled in the sunlight, and Red Riding Hood marveled at their beauty. She filled her basket with flowers, striving to create the perfect bouquet for her grandmother. As she set off for her grandmother's house with the bouquet, she pictured her grandmother's delighted face. Red Riding Hood lost track of time while gathering flowers. Her basket was now overflowing with flowers, to the point where there was no more room left. Red Riding Hood realized that she had gathered enough flowers to complete the bouquet. She looked down at her basket, smiling at the sight of the beautiful flowers inside. Suddenly, she thought of her grandmother. "I need to get to grandmother quickly." Red Riding Hood felt a sense of urgency as she thought about her grandmother waiting for her. Grasping her basket tightly, she hurried towards her grandmother's cottage. Red Riding Hood walked quickly towards her grandmother's house. She followed the forest path, passing various wildflowers and listening to the birds singing cheerfully among the branches. However, she had no time to admire the scenery as she quickened her pace. Her mind was focused solely on reaching her grandmother as soon as possible. The faster Red Riding Hood walked, the more her heart pounded. The fresh forest air felt invigorating, but the worry about her grandmother's illness filled her mind. When she finally saw her grandmother's cottage in the distance, she felt somewhat relieved. But as she got closer, an uneasy feeling began to creep over her. Upon arriving at the house, she noticed that the door was open. Red Riding Hood paused in surprise. "Why is the door open?" she murmured to herself as she cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was quiet and dim. Only a faint beam of sunlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow in the room. Red Riding Hood quietly closed the door behind her and looked around. There was no sign of her grandmother. The room felt unusually chilly. Red Riding Hood searched for any sign of her grandmother. On the table was her grandmother's usual teacup, and the walls were adorned with her grandmother's handmade knitting. However, her grandmother was nowhere to be seen. A strange feeling enveloped her. The door was slightly ajar, and the house was eerily silent. "Oh, why do I feel so uneasy today? I usually love coming to grandmother's house." Red Riding Hood muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. She took careful steps into the room. The house was filled with her grandmother's lovingly placed flower vases and old photos, but today everything felt unfamiliar. The curtains swayed slightly in the breeze, letting in faint light. She looked around the room in search of her grandmother. The bed was hidden behind a curtain, obscuring her grandmother's figure. Red Riding Hood's heart pounded as she moved closer to the bed. She gently pulled back the curtain but still couldn't see her grandmother. Behind the bed, there was nothing. Her unease grew stronger. "Grandmother, hello?" Red Riding Hood called out loudly. Her bright and clear voice echoed through the room. Normally, her grandmother would greet her with a warm smile, but today there was no response. Red Riding Hood called out again, louder this time. "Grandmother! I'm here. It's Red Riding Hood." But the room remained silent, and no sound was heard. The room remained silent. Her grandmother did not respond. Red Riding Hood grew more anxious. She thought her grandmother might be too sick to answer and moved closer to the bed. The house's stillness amplified her anxiety. She slowly walked towards the bed. Her footsteps echoed loudly on the wooden floor. With each step, her anxiety increased. When she reached the bedside, she reached out and gently pulled back the curtain. But her grandmother was still not visible, and the room was dark and quiet. Red Riding Hood called out to her grandmother again. "Grandmother, I'm here. It's Red Riding Hood." Her voice trembled, and she called out louder in frustration. But again, there was no response. Her worry grew. She wondered if her grandmother was really very ill. Standing by the bed, Red Riding Hood looked around the room again. The walls were decorated with her grandmother's handmade knitting and old family photos. Usually, these things felt warm, but today they seemed unfamiliar. She decided to pull back the curtain further to see her grandmother's face. Red Riding Hood reached out and drew back the curtain. As the curtain opened, her grandmother's figure was revealed lying in bed. But unlike usual, her grandmother's face was almost completely hidden by a deeply worn hat. Red Riding Hood wondered why her grandmother was lying like this as she slowly approached. Something about her grandmother's appearance seemed off. Her face was hidden by the hat, and her posture in bed looked uncomfortable. Despite the strange feeling, Red Riding Hood thought her grandmother might be very ill and approached with concern. She leaned in to look at her grandmother's face more closely. "Grandmother, are you okay?" "It's me, Red Riding Hood. I brought cake and wine for Mother." But her grandmother still didn't answer. The only sound was her breathing filling the room. Red Riding Hood's unease grew with her grandmother's unusual behavior. She leaned closer, trying to get a better look at her grandmother's face. The grandmother lay in bed, but her face was almost entirely hidden by the hat, looking rather peculiar. Red Riding Hood thought her grandmother looked a bit strange, but began to ask questions right away. "Grandmother, why are you covering your face like that? And why are you so quiet?" Red Riding Hood asked, looking worriedly at her grandmother's face. She gently held her grandmother's hand and asked again, "Grandmother, are you really okay? Why aren't you moving in bed?" Her grandmother's hand was still cold, and Red Riding Hood was startled by the chill but couldn't let go. She hoped her grandmother would respond. The grandmother's appearance still seemed odd, and Red Riding Hood leaned in closer to look at her face. Red Riding Hood lifted the hat covering her grandmother's face slightly and asked one last time, "Grandmother, what's wrong? Please tell me." Her voice was trembling, and her anxiety grew. Looking at her grandmother's face, Red Riding Hood couldn't shake the strange feeling. "Oh, grandmother, what big ears you have!" Red Riding Hood exclaimed in surprise. She looked closely at her grandmother's face, astonished by the large ears. The ears were much larger than usual, making them look strange. She continued to ask questions, curious about why her grandmother had changed so much. Red Riding Hood leaned in closer to her grandmother's face and asked again, "Grandmother, why are your ears so big?" Her voice was filled with surprise and curiosity. As she waited for her grandmother's answer, her anxiety grew. The large ears looked as if they didn't belong to her grandmother, and Red Riding Hood examined them more closely, trying to find out why. The wolf, imitating the grandmother's voice, replied, "So that I can hear you better, my dear." His voice, however, had a different tone from the usual warm voice of the grandmother. It was low and deep, giving off a sense of something being hidden. Red Riding Hood thought the voice sounded odd, but she nodded, assuming her grandmother was very ill. Red Riding Hood looked at the large ears again, trying to understand why her grandmother had changed so much. She tried to reassure herself with her grandmother's words, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling inside her. Although she couldn't understand why her grandmother's ears were so large, she tried to convince herself that it must be because her grandmother said so. Still feeling strange, Red Riding Hood asked again, "Oh, grandmother, what big eyes you have." She looked more closely at her grandmother's face, staring at the large eyes. Those eyes gave off a sharp feeling, unlike her grandmother's usual soft gaze. Red Riding Hood was startled by her grandmother's large eyes. They were much larger than usual and seemed capable of seeing through everything. The eyes had a cold glint to them. She continued to look at her grandmother's face, trying to see if there was anything else unusual. Although her heart was filled with unease, she continued to ask questions, trying hard to believe her grandmother's words. The wolf replied in a deeper and rougher voice, "So that I can see you better, my dear." His voice was completely different from the warm voice of the grandmother. Red Riding Hood thought the voice sounded strange, but nodded, thinking her grandmother must be very sick. Red Riding Hood continued to feel uneasy as she looked at the large eyes. She couldn't understand why her grandmother's eyes were so big. Her grandmother's answers continued to sound strange, and Red Riding Hood began to worry that her grandmother's condition might be more serious than she thought. She looked more closely at her grandmother's face, preparing another question. She hoped her grandmother's answer would clear her doubts, trying to hide her growing unease. Red Riding Hood continued to ask questions. "Oh, grandmother, what big hands you have," she said, looking at her grandmother's hands with wide eyes. The hands looked big and rough, unlike her grandmother's usual gentle hands. She found it hard to believe that these hands belonged to her grandmother. She couldn't hide her amazement as she looked at the hands again. They felt like they didn't belong to her grandmother at all. Red Riding Hood held her grandmother's hand, surprised by its size and roughness. She tried to understand why her grandmother's hands were so big, asking the reason. She waited for her grandmother's answer, hoping it would explain everything. Trying to hide her anxious heart, she continued to ask questions. The wolf sat up slightly in bed and replied, "So that I can grab you better, my dear." His voice became deeper and rougher. The words sounded nothing like her usual grandmother. Red Riding Hood grew more anxious at the response. The idea that her grandmother's hands were so big to grab her better was just too strange. Red Riding Hood became more confused by her grandmother's answers. She couldn't understand why her grandmother had changed so much. All the memories she had with her grandmother flashed through her mind. But the grandmother in front of her felt so different. Red Riding Hood couldn't shake off her doubts about her grandmother's words. Looking at her grandmother's hands, Red Riding Hood was still surprised by their size and roughness. She tried to understand why they were so big, but the answer that it was to grab her better didn't make sense. Her heart filled with growing fear. Despite feeling something was terribly wrong, Red Riding Hood decided to ask one last question. Red Riding Hood asked the most surprising question. "Oh, grandmother, what a big mouth you have." She looked closely at her grandmother's face. The mouth looked long and sharp, unlike anything she had seen before. It seemed ready to swallow something whole. Red Riding Hood was shocked by the large mouth. She had never seen such a big mouth on her grandmother's face, which made her even more confused. She couldn't understand why her grandmother's mouth was so big. Her grandmother's appearance felt increasingly unfamiliar. With a mix of fear and curiosity, Red Riding Hood waited for her grandmother's answer. Red Riding Hood looked at her grandmother's face, astonished by the length and sharpness of the mouth. She felt like she was looking at something other than her grandmother. As she asked the last question about her grandmother's face, Red Riding Hood tried to figure out what she was missing. Though filled with growing fear, she continued asking questions, hoping her grandmother's answer would reassure her. The wolf, seeing no need to hide anymore, bared his sharp teeth and replied, "So that I can eat you better." His voice was no longer warm like the grandmother's. It was cold and threatening. The wolf revealed his true self, showing his terrifying teeth. His mouth glittered with sharp teeth as he unveiled his hidden plan. Red Riding Hood realized at that moment that everything was wrong. She trembled with fear and took a step back. Red Riding Hood realized that it was not her grandmother in the bed but the wolf. She was so shocked and scared that she tried to scream, but no sound came out. The wolf's sharp teeth and menacing eyes overwhelmed her. She wanted to run, but fear rooted her to the spot. "So that I can eat you better." The wolf's voice echoed in her ears, planting deep fear in her heart. Realizing she was in grave danger, Red Riding Hood tried to find a way to stop the wolf's terrible plan. But she was overwhelmed by the wolf's terrifying appearance, not knowing what to do. As soon as he finished speaking, the wolf jumped out of bed and attacked Red Riding Hood. She tried to scream in surprise, but it was too late. The wolf swallowed her whole in an instant. All the happiness and anticipation Red Riding Hood felt on her way to visit her grandmother turned into fear. As she was being swallowed by the wolf, Red Riding Hood realized how much danger she was in. She struggled in the darkness, but it was useless. The wolf's stomach was cold and sticky, filling her with despair and fear. Red Riding Hood's eyes filled with tears, but no one could hear her cry. In the wolf's stomach, Red Riding Hood thought everything was over. She remembered the happy moments she had with her grandmother, feeling a pang of longing. But now, those memories seemed distant. The wolf's stomach grew darker and scarier, and Red Riding Hood began to accept her fate. Satisfied with his full belly, the wolf returned to bed. He put on the grandmother's clothes and pulled the hat down low over his face, then lay down and drew the curtains. With his stomach full, the wolf soon fell into a deep sleep. As he felt comfortable, he began to snore loudly. His snoring filled the house, echoing off the walls. The loud snoring showed just how deep asleep the wolf was. The wolf buried himself in the warm covers, enjoying the coziness of the grandmother's bed. He lay with his mouth wide open, snoring loudly. The snoring echoed throughout the house, reverberating off the walls and filling every corner. The wolf dreamt contentedly as he slept deeply. The wolf's snoring was so loud it seemed to shake the ceiling. His full belly jostled with every movement, and his snoring grew louder. The wolf, deeply asleep, filled the house with his snoring, and the sound carried outside as well. ' At that moment, a hunter was passing through the forest. Hearing the loud sound coming from the grandmother's house, he stopped in his tracks. He listened carefully. The sound was loud snoring coming from inside the grandmother's house. The hunter looked at the house with a puzzled expression and thought, an old woman snoring that loudly? Something must be wrong. I'd better go in and see what's going on. The hunter cautiously approached the grandmother's house. The sunlight streamed through the trees, casting long shadows. The loud snoring continued from inside the house, heightening the hunter's suspicion. He paused at the door, listening once more to the snoring. The house was quiet except for the loud snoring. The hunter considered knocking but decided to investigate the source of the sound directly. There's no way the old lady would snore this loudly. What could be happening? He muttered to himself as he cautiously grasped the doorknob. The hunter approached the grandmother's house cautiously. He paused at the door, listening again to the sounds inside. The loud snoring continued without pause. The hunter decided to find out what was going on. He reached out and carefully turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, and the hunter stepped inside. The grandmother's house was dark and quiet, with only the loud snoring breaking the silence. The hunter slowly walked towards the source of the sound. The house, though warm and cozy, gave the hunter an uneasy feeling due to the loud snoring. He looked around the room, following the sound. It was clear that the snoring was coming from the grandmother's room. The hunter stood in front of the room, took a deep breath, and carefully opened the door. The hunter entered the room. As he approached the bed, he found the wolf lying there. The wolf was deeply asleep, dressed in the grandmother's clothes, and snoring loudly. The hunter's eyes widened in shock, and he took a step back. The sight was bizarre and frightening, but he tried to collect himself and assess the situation. The wolf, dressed in the grandmother's clothes, was lying in bed, filling the room with his loud snores. The hunter scrutinized the wolf, wondering where the grandmother might be. He cautiously moved closer to the wolf. The wolf was still in a deep sleep, his snores continuing to resonate through the room. In a low voice, the hunter muttered with a shocked expression, "Here you are, you dirty beast. I've been looking for you for a long time." He remembered how this wolf had been terrorizing people in the forest for a long time. The hunter felt a mix of anger and amazement as he stared at the wolf. This was the notorious wolf that had been devouring livestock and frightening people in the village. The hunter had tried multiple times to catch the wolf, but had always managed to escape. And now, the wolf was right in front of him. The hunter cautiously approached the wolf, watching its every move. The wolf remained in a deep sleep, his snores filling the room. The hunter resolved not to miss this opportunity. He slowly reached out and drew his shotgun. The hunter pointed his shotgun at the wolf. The thought that the wolf might have harmed the grandmother strengthened his resolve. He prepared to pull the trigger. The hunter firmly gripped the shotgun and aimed. The wolf's large body was sprawled leisurely on the bed. The loud snores continued, and the wolf was as deeply asleep as ever. The hunter thought this was the perfect chance and began to press the trigger. The hunter paused to think. Wait, the wolf might have swallowed the old lady. She might still be alive inside. I shouldn't shoot. He decided to save the grandmother and Red Riding Hood instead of killing the wolf. The hunter set down the shotgun and instead took out a sharp pair of scissors from his pocket. Looking around the room, he cautiously approached the sleeping wolf and began to cut open its belly. With each snip, the thick skin of the wolf started to part, revealing the insides. As he continued cutting, a glimpse of Red Riding Hood's red cloak appeared. The hunter continued cutting with even more care. The scissors sliced through the wolf's thick skin, creating a larger opening. Gradually, more of Red Riding Hood's cloak came into view. Her arm appeared first. As her arm became free, she instinctively reached out as if trying to escape. The hunter gently grasped her hand and began to pull her out carefully. Hold on a little longer. It's almost over, the hunter reassured her, continuing to cut. After a few more snips, Red Riding Hood's face appeared. Her eyes were still closed, but her faintly trembling lips and chest showed she was alive. The hunter set the scissors aside and used both hands to carefully pull Red Riding Hood out. As her body emerged completely from the wolf's belly, Red Riding Hood took a deep breath and opened her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Hunter," she said with a trembling voice. Her eyes were filled with tears, and her body still shook from the shock. The hunter patted her shoulder to comfort her. "It's all over now. Let's save your grandmother next." Red Riding Hood nodded at his words, wiping her tears. She stepped aside to watch the hunter's next move to save her grandmother. "Oh, it was so dark inside the wolf's belly," Red Riding Hood said, taking a deep breath after emerging from the wolf. She felt as though she had been trapped in a dark belly for a long time. The wolf's insides were cold and sticky, and the confined space made it hard to breathe. Red Riding Hood couldn't forget the fear and pain she felt there. Her face showed exhaustion and fear, but also a sense of relief from surviving. Red Riding Hood looked gratefully at the hunter who had saved her. His face showed determination and relief. He gently held her hand and said kindly, "You're safe now, Red Riding Hood. It must have been so hard for you." Red Riding Hood squeezed the hunter's hand and nodded. Tears welled up in her eyes, showing her gratitude and relief. "Thank you so much, Mr. Hunter. If it weren't for you, I was so scared." The hunter reassured her by patting her back. "You're safe now, don't worry. Just wait a little longer, and we'll save your grandmother too." Red Riding Hood nodded at his words, wiping her tears. She stepped aside to watch the hunter's next move to save her grandmother. The hunter reassured Red Riding Hood, "It's all right now, Red Riding Hood. We'll save your grandmother soon." He set down the shotgun and took out a sharp pair of scissors from his pocket. He began carefully cutting through the thick hide of the wolf. With each snip, the hunter became more cautious. His hands trembled slightly, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he cut through the wolf's belly. Red Riding Hood watched the hunter's hands anxiously. Her heart pounded, and her eyes followed his every movement. As the hunter made one more cut, the thick skin of the wolf parted, revealing the grandmother inside. The grandmother was still alive, but barely breathing after being inside the wolf's belly. As the hunter carefully cut more of the wolf's belly, the grandmother's pale face appeared. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was shallow. Her skin was unusually pale, and her lips were bluish. The hunter carefully pulled her out and handed her to Red Riding Hood. "Grandmother!" Red Riding Hood cried out, tears streaming down her face. She held her grandmother's cold hand and gently helped her to the bed. The bed was covered with soft blankets, and Red Riding Hood carefully laid her grandmother down. The grandmother's body was light and weak. Red Riding Hood stroked her grandmother's face, hoping she would wake up. The grandmother's breathing was still irregular and weak. Red Riding Hood supported her grandmother's head gently, adjusting her position to make her breathing easier. "Grandmother, it's okay now. I'm here," she said, her voice trembling but filled with comfort. The hunter stood by the bed, checking the grandmother's condition. "She needs to take deep breaths. We need to help her breathe easier," he said, holding the grandmother's hand to help her regain some strength. Red Riding Hood caressed her grandmother's face, feeling the coldness with a heavy heart. "Grandmother, please open your eyes." "I'm here," she said, looking at her grandmother's face more closely, hoping she would wake up. She held her grandmother's hand tightly, praying for warmth to return to it. "Grandmother, it's okay now," Red Riding Hood said, comforting her grandmother. She held her grandmother's hand gently, smiling warmly at her. The grandmother slowly opened her eyes and smiled faintly, caressing her granddaughter's face. Her touch was still soft, but she looked weak. The grandmother spoke with difficulty. "Thank you, Red Riding Hood. I'm so glad you're here." Her voice was weak and thin, but it was filled with deep love and gratitude for her granddaughter. Red Riding Hood teared up at her grandmother's words. "Grandmother, you're safe now. I'll always be here for you," she said, her voice tender with reassurance. The hunter watched the touching scene with a warm smile. He was glad he had defeated the wolf and saved the grandmother and Red Riding Hood. "Your grandmother will regain her strength soon. Just hold on a little longer," he encouraged them, giving them hope. The grandmother blinked at her granddaughter's face. She held Red Riding Hood's hand tightly and gave a thankful look to the hunter. She felt deeply grateful, knowing she was alive thanks to her granddaughter and the hunter. Red Riding Hood held her grandmother's hand tightly, promising herself to stay by her side until she fully recovered. The grandmother's face still showed signs of fatigue, but the warm hearts and encouragement from her granddaughter and the hunter helped her gradually regain strength. Red Riding Hood prayed for her grandmother's recovery, holding her hand gently. Their presence gave each other great comfort, and they felt hopeful that they could overcome anything together. The hunter knew he had to make sure the wolf couldn't wake up. Quickly, he looked around and found large stones scattered throughout the forest. The hunter selected the heaviest and biggest stones. Red Riding Hood helped him, placing the stones one by one into the wolf's belly. "These stones are heavy and big, so the wolf won't be able to wake up easily," the hunter explained to Red Riding Hood. She nodded and diligently gathered more stones. The hunter carefully pushed each stone into the wolf's belly. As more stones were added, the wolf's belly began to swell. The process of adding stones was difficult and time-consuming. Red Riding Hood and the hunter worked hard, sweating as they continued. "We need more stones," the hunter said. Red Riding Hood looked around for even bigger stones. She picked up any stone she could find and brought it to the hunter. The stones were heavy, and the wolf's belly became full. Every time they added a stone, the wolf twitched, but Red Riding Hood and the hunter didn't stop. As more stones filled the wolf's belly, the wolf became unable to move. Red Riding Hood and the hunter concentrated even more to finish the task before the wolf fully awoke. Finally, the wolf's belly was packed with stones, and the wolf was weighed down by the heavy load, unable to move. Red Riding Hood and the hunter sighed with relief, confirming the wolf was no longer a threat. "The wolf won't be able to harm us anymore," the hunter said with a sigh of relief. Red Riding Hood nodded and returned to her grandmother. When the wolf finally woke up, he felt an unusual heaviness in his belly. He put his hands on his stomach and pressed here and there, but the heaviness wouldn't go away. The wolf sensed something was wrong, but still didn't fully understand what had happened. "Why do I feel so heavy?" the wolf muttered in confusion as he tried to get up. But his body wouldn't budge. The wolf, now even more perplexed, pressed his belly again, but it still felt like a heavy boulder. He twisted his body to escape, but the weight of the stones prevented him from moving properly. His eyes filled with fear and confusion. The wolf, feeling thirsty, tried to get to the well for a drink, but his body was too heavy to walk properly. He groaned and struggled to take a few steps, but the stones in his belly made it impossible to move easily. He sweated as he took each step, quickly tiring from the weight of the stones. When he finally reached the well, the wolf was exhausted from the heavy stones. He sat beside the well, looking down at his swollen belly in bewilderment. Seeing his belly bulging, the wolf became even more confused. He was incredibly thirsty and thought he needed a drink. As he bent down to drink, he lost his balance and fell into the well. The wolf tried to steady himself, but the stones were too heavy for him to control his movements. Eventually, he plunged into the well with a loud splash, flailing in the water before gradually sinking deeper. "Help!" the wolf cried out one last time, but it was already too late. The wolf sank deeper and deeper until he disappeared into the depths of the well. His voice grew faint and soon vanished entirely. The well returned to its quiet state, leaving no trace of the wolf behind. The three were all satisfied. The hunter was relieved to see that the wolf was no longer a threat. He skinned the wolf and took the pelt home. The pelt became a great trophy for the hunter, and it also served as proof to the villagers that the wolf was no longer a danger. As the hunter walked home that night, he felt a sense of pride for protecting the village. As he walked, he told the villagers about the wolf. They thanked the hunter for his bravery and praised him. The hunter carefully prepared the pelt and hung it on the wall. It became a monument to his courageous act. With the wolf gone, the village returned to its peaceful state, and the people resumed their daily lives with a sense of security. The hunter shared the story with his family, feeling that all his efforts were worthwhile. That night, the hunter fell into a deep sleep, and in his dreams, he heard the laughter of the villagers. A small celebration was held in the village square, where people sang songs honoring the hunter's bravery. The hunter felt proud of what he had done and vowed to continue protecting the village. Meanwhile, the grandmother regained her strength while eating the cake and drinking the wine that Red Riding Hood had brought. "Thank you so much, Red Riding Hood. Thanks to you, I feel much stronger," the grandmother said, smiling warmly at her granddaughter. The sweet taste of the cake and the rich aroma of the wine warmed the grandmother's body and revitalized her tired self. As the grandmother savored each bite of the cake, she closed her eyes to enjoy the taste. "This cake is really delicious. It tastes even better because you brought it with so much care," she said. Drinking the wine, the grandmother felt warmth spreading through her body. She held Red Riding Hood's hand tightly, expressing her gratitude. Red Riding Hood felt relieved to see her grandmother regaining her strength. She treasured the moment she had with her grandmother. "Grandmother, I'll come to see you more often. Please stay healthy," she said. The grandmother nodded, looking lovingly at her granddaughter. "Yes, my dear Red Riding Hood. Having you here makes me so happy." Red Riding Hood and her grandmother shared stories and laughter for a long time. They provided each other with great comfort, promising to meet again soon and sharing a warm hug. The grandmother's house was filled with a peaceful and cozy atmosphere once more. Red Riding Hood cherished the time spent with her grandmother and returned home with those precious memories. "I must never wander off the path and enter the forest alone again. I will listen to my mother when she tells me not to do something," Red Riding Hood resolved. She decided to pay closer attention to her mother and grandmother's advice and to always be careful. This experience had taught her a valuable lesson, making her wiser and more cautious. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Red Riding Hood thought about getting lost in the forest and facing danger, and then being rescued by the hunter. Each moment had been a crucial lesson. She deeply ingrained her mother and grandmother's advice in her heart and decided to act more carefully in the future. From then on, Red Riding Hood no longer wandered aimlessly through the forest. She always listened to her mother's words and followed her grandmother's guidance. This experience had transformed Red Riding Hood into a more mature and responsible girl. Thus, Red Riding Hood and her grandmother returned to a peaceful and safe life. Red Riding Hood cherished the time she spent with her grandmother, understanding the importance of love and care. She felt more grateful for every moment shared with her grandmother. The grandmother felt how much her granddaughter had grown during their time together. She believed that Red Riding Hood would always live wisely and bravely. Red Riding Hood and her grandmother brought great comfort and joy to each other, and their bond grew even stronger. The villagers admired Red Riding Hood's courage and wisdom, loving her even more. Red Riding Hood shared the lessons she had learned with others, helping everyone live safely and happily. She enjoyed the precious time with her grandmother and lived with a deep understanding of the importance of love and care. And so, Red Riding Hood and her grandmother spent their days in peace and happiness, loving and cherishing each other more than ever.